The GPS DairyCAST features the high-value insights of the GPS Dairy Consulting team's trusted advisors and the owners and managers from the elite dairy farms they serve. These conversations deliver on the GPS Dairy Consulting promise to inspire change and grow leaders.
This episode of the GPS DairyCAST is brought to you by Adiseo, a global leader in nutritional solutions and the provider of Smartamine M, the best-in-class rumen-protected methionine product for ruminants. Welcome to the GPS DairyCAST. I'm your host, Peggy Coffeen from the Uplevel Dairy Podcast, and we are bringing you a conversation from the 2026 GPS Leaders Forum, where Geoffrey Dahl from the University of Florida sits down with Megan Abeyta from the GPS Dairy Consulting team to talk about dry period heat stress and profound impacts that can affect generations in the future of your herd. All this and more here today on the GPS DairyCAST. This episode is brought to you by Adiseo, a global leader in nutritional solutions and the provider of Smartamine M, the best-in-class rumen-protected methionine product for dairy producers who want to optimize milk production, capture more value from their components, and maintain the lifetime performance of their herds. For more product information and to calculate your return on investment when you balance your feed with amino acids, go to milkpay.com.
Thank you a lot for being here today. I found your talk to be quite fascinating, and given my background in stress and inflammation, I found it so relevant, right, to our producers' success and just how important it is to cool our dry cows.
Well, I think it's important to think about the whole dry period too, and that's what I tried to emphasize in the talk a bit. I become more and more convinced we can screw up more in the dry period than we can fix in lactation. So if we take care of it during the dry period, then I think that we're off to a much better potential start for those animals, and it's much less likely to have issues as they move into lactation.
I think one of the more striking things that you said, and we'll get into the reasons as to why, is if you had to choose where you were going to put cooling between dry cows and lactating, that you would choose the dry cows. And that's something I've never heard before. And it was quite striking to me because most people would choose lactating.
And I think that there's a lot of people that would argue with me. My reasoning for that is that when we cool the dry cows, we see that effect persist for the entire lactation. And so, to me, I would think that it would be less costly just to cool our dry cows because it's a smaller cohort of our total herd. But also, if you're going to limit me, I want to cool the dry cows so that they have the improvement and greater capacity for production throughout the rest of lactation, even if they are then experiencing heat stress at times.
Yeah. So can you reiterate just how impactful in regards to milk yield? And we'll talk more about reproduction and stuff, but how much milk are we talking here?
Well, I mean, when we've run analyses across multiple studies, it looks like it's between 8 to 10 pounds a day for mature cows. A little less for animals in their first lactation, but I just want to emphasize that when we looked at springers, they respond to late gestation cooling similarly to the mature cows. And so it's just as important to get those springers in and realize the benefit of late gestation cooling as it is the cow going into her fourth lactation. So I would say conservatively in that 8 pound a day range is going to be pretty consistent.
Yeah. And do you think you would see that same 8 pounds if you didn't have cooling post? What do you think the milk yield response if you just did dry period?
Yeah, well, this is my point that, I think that difference would still be there. It's just going to be at a lower level for all the cows.
Yep. So you talked a little bit about mammary gland development, what it's doing to those mammary cells.
Right.
And can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, what I think the nexus of the effects on the cow and on the developing fetus occur at the placenta. And so placental function is important not only to that calf's development, but there are a lot of hormones produced, obviously, by the placenta as well that are going to influence mammary development. And so I think that that's probably some of what we're seeing in the lower mammary development is because hormonally that placenta is not as functional as the animal that is cooled.
And you even were going into how when a dam is heat stressed, that her granddaughter will show impacts of this heat stress in her lactation performance and survivability on farm.
The calves that are born to a heat stressed dam, of course, when they're born, they are going to have all of the follicles on their ovaries that they're going to produce over their lifespan. And so we are not just affecting that calf that's born, we're affecting that calf's reproductive potential and her follicles for life. And so anything that she is experiencing in utero is also going to be experienced by her daughters.
Which I think has been a really eye-opening discovery to a lot of producers. I know I have clients that I'm like, hey, this is impacting the granddaughters. They're like, huh? And they're like, well, maybe we should think about this more.
And it's all consistent with a lot of the popular press that you see for human medicine and human development, right? The influence of things that occur on developing fetuses, babies, that they can have lifelong deficiencies or increased disease and other things due to insults that occurred when they were in utero. And this is just fetal programming 101. It's the same sort of impact.
Actually, one of the images that was also quite striking was just the size of the ovary that was coming from the calves that were born to either cooled or heat stress. There was a drastic difference in the size.
Yeah, and we see that in a number of the organs of interest. So we see that also in immune organs, that there's less development there. We see it obviously in the mammary gland. I showed some of those photos as well. Certain ones, like the adrenal glands, for instance, are actually increased in size. And so that, again, could be a response to that stressor that is affecting their adrenal development, cortisol production, other responses later in life.
Absolutely, and that obviously impacts important things like reproductive performance and milk, like you've discussed. You did touch on the reproductive impacts of heat stress during the dry period, and kind of what you want to expand a little bit more on that for both the cow and the heifer?
Right, on the cow side, I mean, we have not a lot of data, but it all points to the sort of reduction in reproductive performance of those animals that experience heat stress when they're dry, which would be consistent with all of the other effects. In the calf, for sure, she is set up for a poorer reproductive phenotype for all the reasons that we talked about already, that there is just limited, or they're more limited gonadal development in those animals. There's smaller follicular reserve. Hormonally, those animals may be compromised. When I say all of these things, I really want to emphasize that it's not that they are outside of the normal range of responses. But when we heat stress the animals in utero, we are limiting their ability to express their genetic potential. And that is really why I talk about calves that are coming from the cooled animals. They're up here. They're able to fully express their genetic potential. This is, those same genetics, but those animals have less of a ability to express that genetic potential. And that's, again, consistent with epigenetics and fetal programming. We're not changing the genetic sequence, the genetic code of those animals, but we are changing and influencing how effectively and efficiently it's expressed. And we have data at the DNA level to show that there are differences in methylation patterns, which are going to affect gene expression, and that can then lead to some of these physiologic outcomes.
And you mentioned something about mammary gland capacity, and I know we touched a little bit on like mammary gland development and all of that, but it physically shrunk the capacity of the mammary gland, right?
So at birth, right, the mammary gland, it has potential to develop, obviously, and it develops into a fat pad. And there are effects on that fat pad that can either diminish or increase the ability for the secretory aspect to actually infiltrate in there and grow. So I think both of those are being negatively impacted by the heat stress in utero. We have some new information that fat pad is affected by in utero heat stress, but also that as you saw on our slides, the animals that are born to a heat stress dam just have smaller mammary parenchyma at birth and at weaning. Weaning in particular.
And that's not the only thing. They also had profound impacts on their ability to take up IgGs, right? So the immune system's also really involved for both cows and heifers, it sounds like.
Yeah. So in the cow that's heat stressed, when she is heat stressed, in late gestation, there are definite negative impacts on the acquired immune system. So their ability for white blood cell responses, for them to produce antibodies in response to an antigen, those are suppressed directly by the heat stress. But we also see effects on the innate immune system. So that's going to be the neutrophil capacity in those animals. And those seem to be not so much a direct effect of the heat stress, but there are the same sort of carryover effects that we see with production and other impacts. The innate immune cells of interest really are neutrophils, and they are at a higher level in the animals that were cooled when they were dry versus the animals that are heat stressed. Now in the calf, what we see is that there is less immunoglobulin uptake if they were heat stressed in utero versus the animals that were cooled. Regardless of the amount of colostrum that they receive, it's not an effect on the colostrum. I think that we've determined pretty clearly that that is not where this is happening. This is an effect on the calf itself, and there is definitely a morphological difference in terms of their gut closure, and it seems to be either not as mature, or it's acceleration of gut closure occurring in those animals that are heat stressed versus the calves that are born to a cooled dam. And so that may be partially due to the fact that they're born 3 or 4 days sooner, and so they haven't had the opportunity to get full expression of that maturation of that gut that's going to then absorb immunoglobulin. Or it could just be that heat stress in utero causes that process to start sooner. Either way, the effect is that they have less capacity for immunoglobulin uptake if they've been heat stressed in utero versus being cooled.
Right. And those calves also showed more health problems, more likely to die, and lighter body weights throughout the entire lifetime until they were mature, right?
Well, it's lighter body weight through a year of life.
Right.
And then
Yes.
it looks like there is compensatory gain, and so there's no difference in body weight at the time those animals calve for their first time. But obviously, there are potential differences in composition of gain in that second year of life. And so what those animals may actually carry in terms of fat versus protein, lean mass, that type of thing could be very different, because they are different in body weight up to a year of life. And I suspect that's probably what's happening, that there's differences in composition of those animals. We just have not done slaughter studies to confirm that.
I guess a little bit back to the colostrum topic, simply because this time of year is really tough for producers in regards to colostrum yield. Now, you guys found that there was maybe a slight difference in yield, not enough to be completely gone, but that there wasn't a difference in quality, correct?
So we see, and again, depends on how you define quality, but if we're defining quality as immunoglobulin concentration, we don't see a difference. We do see a significant reduction in yield. We have not seen, for the most part, yields that were so low that they would be of a concern, and we've always gotten enough, well, I'll say almost, I'm going to say always gotten enough from the heat-stressed animals to get to that 4-liter mark. But we definitely don't see any concentration of IgG differences.
If you're enjoying this podcast and you want to learn more about GPS Dairy Consulting, make sure to join our email list. Our announcements aren't just for GPS clients, but instead for anyone looking to advance their dairy business. Learn more about GPS and take a deeper dive into dairy farming hot topics. Stay in the loop with our once-weekly emails and have all GPS DairyCAST podcasts, blog posts, event announcements, and monthly newsletters sent straight to your inbox. You can join the GPS email list by clicking the link in the show notes.
So maybe it's part of the story as to why colostrum yield goes down this time of year, but maybe not the whole story.
Right. I mean, the other thing to remember is that this time of year, we also have changes in lighting.
Yep.
And we have come from the summer when we had the most extended lighting. We had the highest temperatures, and both of those are going to increase prolactin concentrations. That would then be declining as we see the sort of move into the fall, but anytime we have an elevation in a hormone, typically we're going to have the reverse response to the hormone's receptor. And so, not that this is all speculation, but I think that we have a difference in sensitivity to prolactin because those animals have had very high prolactin during the summer due to the lighting, due to the heat stress. And as they approach into the fall, there's less sensitivity then. And prolactin is intimately involved in immunoglobulin uptake by the mammary gland. And so that physiology seems to be consistent with at least a potential reduction in volume.
Along those lines, something we hear about is the fall slump in milk yield, right? And one of your interesting graphs that you had was that the peak in temperature does not necessarily correlate with the lowest milk production. There's actually a lag in when milk drops. It's, maybe a month or two later.
Correct.
And that's
exactly.
Cows are heat stressed in the summer, and then they calve in and they're milking in the fall.
Yeah, and as we've seen people go to more intensive management of dry cows, getting them cooled for the entire time, they haven't sort of gotten rid of that oscillation completely, but they've definitely seen that it is flattened. And so that would be, again, more evidence that part of that was due to more heat stress exposure of those animals as they came into the fall previously. I guess one thing that we talked about in the first one too, a lot of times, particularly in the Midwest and Northeast, I get a little bit of pushback that we don't get heat stress very much, and our heat stress isn't as severe. I think a couple of responses to that. One, I think that cows adapt a little bit more to heat stress in our environment than they might up here, and so they might be a little more sensitive to a temperature that our animals may not really experience as heat stress. And that also goes then to how we perceive heat stress. The dairy cow typically has a temperature about 3 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than our normal temperature. And so when it's hot for us, it's been hot for her for a long time. And I think people have to keep that in mind when they're considering whether animals are heat stressed or not. They get heat stressed before we do. And the other thing is that we typically move from air-conditioned conditions, or at least, I guess, more controlled environments. Our cows are typically in a free stall or in a tie stall in a tunnel ventilated barn, but still, those environments are going to not be as controlled as our environments would be. So again, from a perception standpoint, we might not feel heat stress when she is actually quite heat stressed. And that's why I think it's important for the cows to be the indicator rather than any temperature, any humidity, any THI indicator. What is she doing? What is she telling us? And that doesn't have to be taking rectal temperatures, although many of the monitoring systems that are out there now can give us information on temperature. But respiration rate is one good indicator, and I think a very useful indicator to use. It's non-invasive. We can do it and not disturb animals.
You run out there with your phone stopwatch.
Exactly,
Yep.
exactly. And if they're over 60, I think that they're starting to experience heat stress. And as that increases, that heat stress is becoming more and more severe. So I would say that that's an important consideration for people to make and not be too quick to assume that heat stress doesn't occur in other areas of the country. It may not be as long term as we experience in Florida, but certainly heat stress can be as severe or even worse in certain areas of the Northeast and Midwest.
Yeah. So how important is humidity?
Well, I think that humidity for us is really the killer, because what we experience is obviously reasonably high temperatures. Not as high as you might experience up here. We rarely will get over 95 degrees, but what's different is in particularly the more early morning hours, when cows would typically be sort of getting rid of heat in a more temperate environment, because there'd be the ability to get rid of that heat. With our humidity at 72, 73 degrees, 99% humidity, they have a very hard time at just getting rid of heat unless we have active cooling for those animals, unless we're getting them wet and then pushing that dampness off of that moisture off of the animals and pulling heat with it. Just sweating and trying to get cool in a humid environment is more difficult than in a drier environment.
One of the studies that you did, you mentioned before about cooling for the entire dry period. And you had one study where you had 4 different treatments with cooling the entire time, hot the entire time, and then switching versus the far off versus close up. Can you describe some of the results from that study? Because it's actually quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it gets to the question of how much of the dry period do we have to cool the cows for to see some of these benefits. And we had initially set up 2 groups of animals. They were either heat stressed or cooled for the first part of the dry period, and then halfway through, again, this is a 6-7 week dry period, we took half of each of those groups and we put them on the other treatment. So we ended up with cows that had been cooled the entire dry period, cows that were heat stressed the entire dry period, cows that went from cooling for the first part of the dry period to heat stress during the close-up phase, and cows that went from heat stress early on to cooling in the later phase. And we saw that there really wasn't any difference between the animals that were heat stressed the entire time or whether they were heat stressed early on or heat stressed late. And when we've looked at that, I mean, you can really consider the dry period to be two phases. The first phase is involution, when those cells are turning over and there's a preparation for proliferation later in that final phase of the dry period. And I think that heat stress during either one of those times sort of causes stagnation of those processes, and you just don't see that sort of maximization of an optimization of mammary development during the dry period. And that results in those animals, their milk production was the same whether they were heat stressed early in the dry period, late in the dry period, or for the whole dry period, versus the cows that were cooled.
Yeah, and I think even the gestation length was shorter, if I'm not mistaken. Even the cows that were cooled and close-up compared to the cows that were hot the entire time.
Correct.
So it was almost better to just cool them all
Well, not the
time.
ones that were hot the whole time. The ones that were hot
Okay.
the whole time, they weren't different, but they were less than the animals that were cooled for the entire dry
Got it.
period.
Yep, that part. Yep. Great. Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, thank you very much for this. The talk was fascinating. I think it's a really relevant and important topic for our producers to understand. We cannot ignore our dry cows. It has a very large impact on overall farm production and profitability and everything.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of powerful data to help people make those decisions. So
Good.
appreciate what you do.
Thanks. Thanks.
You just heard from Megan Abeyta from the GPS Dairy Consulting team and Geoff Dahl from the University of Florida. Thank you for listening to this episode of the GPS DairyCAST. I'm your host, Peggy Coffreen from the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. And join us again for our next episode of the GPS DairyCAST.
The GPS DairyCAST features conversations that deliver on the GPS Dairy Consulting promise to inspire change and grow leaders. If this GPS DairyCAST has you looking for more ways to become an elite dairy producer, find more information in our show notes on how you can add a GPS advisor to your team.
This episode is brought to you by Adiseo, a global leader in nutritional solutions and the provider of Smartamine M, the best-in-class rumen-protected methionine product for dairy producers who want to optimize milk production, capture more value from their components, and maintain the lifetime performance of their herds. For more product information and to calculate your return on investment when you balance your feed with amino acids, go to milkpay.com.